Coherent extrapolated volition is our wish. If we knew more, thought faster, were more the people we wished we were, had grown up farther together, where the extrapolation converges rather than diverges, where our wishes cohere rather than interfere, extrapolated as we wish that they extrapolated, interpreted as we wish that they were interpreted. So this is some pretty heavy stuff to try to convert into code.
Welcome to Doom Debates. I'm Liron Shapira. Today I'm doing something a little bit unusual, and I'm reacting to a talk from all the way back in 2016. So not part of the contemporary AI Doom debate, but something that was somewhat ahead of its time. It's an anti-AI Doom talk by Maciej Ceglowski, who's the founder of bookmarking site Pinboard, and frequently blogs and tweets under the Pinboard account. I'm a big fan of Maciej overall as an entrepreneur and a really sharp, independent thinker. I think it's interesting to come back to his talk 8 years later, now that the AI Doom issue has heated up so much, and go through it point by point, because he's put together such a nice, well thought out list of points that I think you're going to enjoy how we take it one by one and find the crux of disagreement in each. I thought this was such a great talk that when I cut to the talk, it's actually going to be the entire unabridged talk. I'm not editing anything out. I'm just frequently interrupting it in order to respond. So please enjoy. Let's dive right in.
I'm here to talk about a very strange topic. I hope you'll have confidence in me. We're going to spread our wings a bit, and then you have to believe that I will land the plane after 40 minutes, and you won't feel that I've completely wasted your time. But I want to talk to you about what happens when the people at the top of your industry who run it believe something insane, and how to cope. I'm going to talk today about the problem of superintelligence. So in 1945, the Americans were developing the atomic bomb, and they were about to test it at Trinity. There was an odd aspect to the atomic bomb, which was that the conditions that it would create had never existed on Earth before. It would create temperatures higher than anything the Earth had ever seen. And at some point, somebody asked the question, what if this lights the atmosphere on fire? Kind of a valid question, and you want to know the answer to it before you press the big red button.
It's a very valid question, and one way to think about this kind of question is, does a nuclear bomb's fuel all exist inside of the original bomb? Or is the entire atmosphere the fuel, and in the case of AI, is the entire universe the fuel, right? So if we can contain the weapon to have entirely onboard fuel, then that's potentially a much easier safety problem. So of course you want to ask that question about nukes. In the case of AI, it's not even a question that AI can use other resources as fuel. The entire question is just how powerful is it? But it's a very interesting analogy. I love pumping this analogy, so I wonder where he's going to go with it.
So the impetus for the question was this kind of equation with nitrogen is not really stable. If you take two nitrogen molecules and you smush them together hard enough, they'll create magnesium and an alpha particle and a lot of energy. So the question that had to be solved is how self-sustaining is this reaction? If we light the atmosphere on fire, will it be like throwing a match on top of a pile of dead wood? And there was a similar question for the oceans. They're full of hydrogen. Hydrogen likes to fuse together. Is exploding an atomic bomb going to destroy the planet?
That's an interesting detail where in the case of a nuclear bomb, when you talk about lighting the atmosphere on fire, it's not the kind of chemical exothermic reaction that normal fire is. They're talking about, is it going to be a nuclear chain reaction? So is it going to light the atmosphere on a nuclear fire, more of like what the sun is compared to what a fire in your fireplace is? Interesting detail.
I'm standing here, you're listening to me, so obviously the answer is it does not destroy the planet. But it was kind of a valid thing to interrogate yourselves about. But I would also point out that the fact that it didn't kill the planet didn't make dealing with nuclear power or nuclear weapons any more easy. It was just something that had to be asked and answered.
I would argue that it made it a little bit easier to deal with nuclear weapons when exploding one doesn't completely destroy the planet, but okay, go on.
So last year this book came out called Superintelligence. I wonder if you could raise your hand if you've read this book or read about it. So not too many people have. I'm going to give you a quick summary of it, but it asks the same question about this new technology that we've created of machine learning. Machine learning is affecting our lives in all kinds of ways. It's upsetting the balance of power between countries and between companies and people. But there's also a subset of the tech industry that believes that there is a much more dangerous scenario, kind of like the blowing up the atmosphere scenario, where a machine intelligence might rapidly become more intelligent than human beings and then get up to some nefarious stuff, persuade us to build ways for it to affect the world and then exterminate the human race. This idea seems to gain more credence the smarter you are. So like the top of the cream of our Silicon Valley intellectuals believe it. Elon Musk has signed this open letter. Stephen Hawking signed it. Bill Gates is on board with it. So there's kind of there's a lot of legitimacy to the idea. But it's also an insane idea. I want to walk you through it. There's a bunch of premises you have to accept, and if you accept the premises, the conclusion flows out kind of semi-naturally. So let's start with. One is the proof of concept. All of us have this kind of box of meat on our heads that we use to get through the day. I'm using it to give the talk, you're using it to listen to me. Sometimes it's capable of rational thought. So we know that in our universe there are these configurations of matter that can think, because we all have one. Almost all. The second premise you have to accept is that there's no weird quantum shenanigans or anything happening in your head, that your brain is just a mechanical system like anything else in the universe. So if you're religious and you believe that you have a soul, you might step off at this premise. Or if you think like Roger Penrose, that there's some weird quantum things happening in microtubules, you won't accept this premise. But it's kind of a mainstream one, that if we had a powerful enough computer, in principle we could simulate our entire brain and the activity that happens there. Right now we can simulate a nematode worm, but we're working our way upwards.
That's right. So there's a few people who get off on a very early stop on the doom train where they say, computers aren't even the same type of thing as a human brain. It's a bad analogy. The brain isn't a computer. When it's quite obvious that yes, the brain is a computer. Everything that the brain does, which is interesting, is an optimization of the idea of computing an ideal function. Right, so it's just taking an input and producing an output. It's not really controversial that the brain maps inputs to outputs, so therefore the brain is a function. The brain implements a function in the physical world. So then the question of whether the brain does computation is a question of whether the brain breaks down that input-output function into a bunch of intermediate steps that can be modeled on a classical computer. Now, the Church-Turing thesis says that, yes, everything can be broken down as steps that can be modeled on a classical computer, and it's an extremely strong thesis. I haven't seen any significant challenges whatsoever. Okay, Penrose thinks that microtubules tap into quantum effect, but even then, generally, quantum computers just have mostly a quadratic speedup on all the interesting search problems that the human brain would do. So so it's a quadratic speedup to a biological system which is slow as heck anyway, so who cares? Computers are already probably faster than human brain even with a quadratic speedup. So I just don't see why anybody at this point would be getting off the doom train at the point of saying, oh, the human brain does something other than computation. So I agree with Maciej. Let's continue on the mainstream. Let's keep riding the mainstream doom train and keep getting to other objections.
The next premise is that the space of possible minds is very, very large. So we happen to have a brain that thinks the way it does and has the types of emotions and instincts that it does because we evolved from animals in a certain direction. But that doesn't mean that every brain that we would create would think in a way that would be familiar to us. And this premise says that, in fact, most minds that you could imagine or create would be very alien from our perspective.
Yeah, this is one of the early arguments that Bostrom and Eliezer would bust out. I feel like these days we want to make an argument that's more subtle because, sure, mind design space is huge. Sure, humans are a tiny point in mind design space. But it's not like, hey, we're going to roll the dice and pick a random point in mind design space, which is the obvious counter-argument. Everybody's like, look, we're working to build a mind that we're controlling where it is in mind design space, so who cares about a dice roll, right? I think Quentin Pope and Nora Belrose love to make this argument of why are you measuring mind design space? We're just going to find a point that we like in mind design space. We're not going to randomly choose. Okay, I get it, but I wouldn't even frame the argument that way in the first place. I would just say, hey, most intelligences are just such good optimizers that they don't really look like a random point in mind design space. They just look like a point on a one-dimensional scale of how good are you at optimizing. So if you think about chess AIs, Sure, you have different chess AIs playing in different parts of chess AI design space, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter very much. It really just matters what their ELO score is. They're just going to play you chess, and some are going to play chess better, and that's all that matters. It doesn't really matter their internal details that much. So when we think about the AIs that humans are building, when we look at humanity, the key thing to notice isn't, oh, we're just at a random part of my design space. The key thing to notice is that because our intelligence is not that good at being general, our general IQ is just barely good enough to build a civilization. So it's not like in the upper regions of like many thousands or millions of IQ points, right? It's just in like the 100 IQ point range, this very low range. When you have a very low IQ, suddenly other factors come into play like, hey, how strong are your muscles? How good are your cells at metabolizing energy? Because if you wake up in the morning and you have more energy to power you through your day, you're probably going to do better at your research. You're probably going to deliver more work. So you're going to appear as if you have a few more IQ points because of this random contingent fact about something in your mind design space or your organism design space. Like, oh wow, your brain is good at pumping ATP throughout your neurons. You have more like white cells. All these contingent details are just going to pop up, and they're only going to make a difference because your IQ is so damn low that these other random details become interesting. But they're going to stop being interesting when we talk about the areas of mind design space when the AI is just really smart, when it's just a really good optimizer. So that's my latest thinking on this whole idea of like points in mind design space. My latest thinking is that when you look at a human, yes, a human is so barely smart that all these random contingent factors start to matter. Like, yes, human morality, the intuitions that we evolved about human morality from being in groups and being a social species and playing non-zero sum games with other individuals that don't share our genes that much. So we had to like evolve trade and evolve morality and evolve cooperation even outside of our family. These are kind of contingent details that do make us an interesting point in mind design space. But when you pick an AI, yes, it doesn't have the evolutionary history of like valuing cooperation and being altruistic, but that detail of its history is only going to matter in how it shapes its utility function. Its design is going to be a utility optimizer. It's not going to have an interesting design. It's not really going to matter like, oh, how is it going to optimize utility? It's just going to optimize utility. Okay, long term, it's just going to optimize utility. It's not going to be anything else other than a utility maximizer. So again, when we talk about mind design space, really, I think we're just talking about details that shape the utility function that then feeds into this utility optimizer. So hopefully that kind of updates the conversation on the mind design space topic.
A good way to think of this is what the natural world produces when it comes to maximizing for speed. So the fastest land animal is the cheetah. And if you live in a pre-industrial civilization, you might think that this is as fast as anything can go on Earth. But of course we know that's false. You can take a bunch of atoms and you can assemble them into a Ducati motorcycle, and it goes much, much faster than a cheetah, and even looks a little bit cooler. But to get to this motorcycle, there's no real evolutionary pathway other than creating human beings, which will then build it for you. So analogously, there might be a way that we can create minds that are much, much more intelligent than our own, but that just weren't available to evolution. And there's no upper limit necessarily on intelligence that's anywhere close to ours. Maybe the smartest anything can be is twice as smart as people. Maybe it's 60,000 times as smart. That's an empirical question. We just don't know the answer to it.
Yeah, everything he just said, I think, is an incredibly strong argument why we should expect artificial superintelligence pretty soon.
Then the next premise you have to accept is that there's plenty of room left for Moore's law to do its thing. This is looking a little bit shaky in practice, but in theory we know the limits on computation are very, very high, and we can get considerably further than we have. We can double and double and double for decades more before we hit any sort of physical limit, rather than, say, an economic limit or what people are just willing to build factories to try to do. So there's lots and lots of room for computers to become faster and smaller and more efficient.
Correct. Purely on a hardware basis, there's many orders of magnitude that you could be faster at computing than the human brain, and also many orders of magnitude that you could be faster at computing than the best silicon hardware. But even with today's hardware, I'm personally very convinced that purely by having better algorithms than the human brain runs, you can vastly overtake the human brain. I don't think we necessarily need that much hardware improvement, but we're just going to get everything, right? So in my mind, it's vastly overdetermined that we have the conditions for superintelligence coming soon.
And the penultimate premise is that if we create an artificial intelligence, it will operate on timescales that are computer timescales and not human ones. For us, to get to the point where I can give this talk, I had to be born and grow up and learn a lot of stuff and go to university. It takes a while, but computers can work tens of thousands of times more quickly.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, computers do have all these incredibly powerful primitives that humans can't match. So the moment a computer gets even human level intelligent, never mind a little bit super intelligent, suddenly you can copy yourself all over the internet. You can get into the nooks and crannies of every single computer chip, many billions of computer chips. Individual devices have multiple types of computer chips within them. And imagine attacking at the very low hardware, even firmware level of all of these different devices, embedding so deeply that the only way you can hope to extract them is if there's a super intelligent antivirus and the arms race is working in favor of defense. I mean, a real chaos scenario here, and all because the super intelligences have the primitive where they can just easily copy, right? They can easily clone in a way that a human requires like a 20-year generation.
And then this is the most American premise, and I like it the most. This is Tony Robbins, the motivational speaker. The premise is that any artificial intelligence we create is going to want to improve itself. It's going to want to be a better AI, do its job more effectively, so that it's going to have an impetus to start recursively redesigning and improving its own system.
Yeah, and if you accept the premise that an AI is going to be a utility optimizer, where you can just input a condition of an end state that you want, and it's going to really effectively achieve that end state, then you don't really need much of a separate assumption to infer that it's going to seek power, right? Instrumental convergence is a theorem about how utility maximizers figure out that it's instrumentally good to seize power, seize money. That's purely a statement about the relationship between terminal goals and instrumental goals. So the load-bearing assumption about what to expect of AI, if you just make one assumption that AI is going to be modelable as a utility maximizer, you don't really need a separate assumption. It's almost the other way around. You kind of need an assumption to describe why you shouldn't expect instrumental convergent behavior. So I guess I'm just nitpicking how he called it a separate assumption, but intuitively it sounds like a separate assumption, so fair enough.
Now, if you accept all of these premises, what you get is a terrible disaster. Because at some point, as computers get faster, as we program them to be more intelligent, there's going to be a runaway effect, sort of like an explosion, where something will become sufficiently smart to begin self-improving, American style, and it's not going to stop until it hits a natural limit, which might be very, 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 very much more than a human intelligence. And at that point, this monstrous sort of intellectual creature will be able to, through devious modeling of what our emotions and intellect are like, persuade us to do things like give it access to factories so it can build, make DNA replicators and all sorts of stuff. It gets very sci-fi very quickly.
Yes, but if you prefer, you can keep it non-sci-fi and just say it's ridiculously good at manipulation. So there's no sci-fi technology that ever happens besides the AI, but it just has everybody believing in its movement, crushing the opposition, slowly pushing toward totalitarianism. Nobody builds a faction powerful enough to stop it. So even without saying, hey, it's going to make nanotech, it's going to push scientific progress, 2 millennia within 10 years, it's not going to do anything crazy. It's just going to be really, really good at manipulating humans. It's going to be like Hitler, right? Hitler manipulated civilized Germany into being crazy, and the AI is going to be even more potent than that.
So let's talk a specific scenario. Say I want to build a robot to say funny things. I work on the team, and our researchers, every day we build, we redesign our software, we compile it, and then the robot tells us a joke. So in the beginning, the robot's jokes aren't very funny. It's kind of at the lower limits of what people can do. But we persevere, we work, and we start getting to the point where the robot is saying things that are making us chuckle. And at this point, the robot's getting smarter as well, and it starts helping us design the next version. It has a good sense of what's funny and what's not. And at some point, it gets to a near superhuman level where it's better than any of its designers are. And at this point, we get the runaway effect. The researchers go home for the weekend. The robot says, all right, I'm going to redesign my operating system so I'm a little bit funnier and a little bit smarter. It optimizes the part that's good at optimizing. And it does this again and again and again and again. And when the researchers come in on Monday, the robot tells them a joke and they die laughing because it is 10,000 times funnier than anything that the human brain can possibly handle. This is, of course, the famous scene from Monty Python's The Funniest Joke in the World. So it is now exterminating the human species with laughter because its goal is to be funny. And even if some people manage to send it a message before they hear the wry, self-deprecating comeback that kills them, all the robot will say is, I don't really care whether you live or die because I'm just here to be funny. And then after it's killed after it's killed humanity, it builds rockets and nano-rockets and expands to the galaxy to try to find other species to make them laugh. So this is a caricature of Bostrom's argument, but I'm trying to vaccinate you against it rather than persuade you of it. So in rough outlines, this is what it is.
That's an interesting idea. So he straw-manned the argument. He started giving a weaker, nonsensical version of the argument, because that way when you hear the real argument, you can connect it to this weaker version that you heard so that you'll be vaccinated against it. I mean, I like how Maciej is like a very coherent thinker. He's making a lot of sense. This kind of seems like a dick move, seems kind of lowbrow, but okay, I gotta respect the game.
So I want to go over there's a more succinct version of this that I like too. This is from Perry Bible Fellowship. You see Hugbot has installed something in his hug capacitor. The scientists think it's adorable, and he ends up destroying the earth because of his desire to hug everybody. This is, again, in caricature, exactly what Bostrom and people like him are arguing. So the salient points of this are this is slow to start, the process of recursive improvement, because it involves human beings and human designers. They go home at 5 o'clock, they have dinner, they sleep. So it takes a while, but as soon as the AI exceeds our abilities, it takes off and starts happening on a computer time scale. Again, there's no obvious ceiling on how much ability it has until it hits some physical limit that we don't know about. And most interestingly, these AIs are evil by default. Not because they're malevolent, but because they have a different value system altogether than human beings do.
The concept of them having a different value system is a little bit misleading, the same as the concept of them being a different point in mind design space. I feel that that's a bit misleading. The key concept for me is they're utility maximizers, and their utility function isn't humans' utility function, because we don't understand utility function loading. And from there, you hand it over from premise to pure logical implication. If you just accept the premise, as I said, it's a utility maximizer, we didn't load the human utility function into it, then you can let pure logic take over and tell you that it's going to put the universe into a hell state, because optimizing utility functions other than the human utility function usually tends to destroy everything that humans value. So instrumental convergence, that's logically implied by the premises I said. So anyway, that's kind of a different mental model than what he's saying of like, oh, it'll have a different value system. Like, maybe we're saying the same thing, but I'm saying something that I think is a little simpler, which is like, everybody's ultimately converging toward utility maximization, and the AI is going to converge toward utility maximization, and by virtue of it being a utility maximizer that's more powerful than humans and not having human utility loaded into it, okay, yes, then you have this emergent property that it has a different value system. But I don't see that as a primitive distinction.
Any assumptions we have about altruism, whatever, they don't hold unless they're designed into the AI. And if we let it happen by chance, it's just going to have some value system that we probably don't even understand. And the final point I'll make is that you'll see this definition of intelligence here is very, very slippery. Like, at some points it's about being funny, at some points it's about being a really good designer of AIs, at some points it's like being just a genial thing that can talk to people. So a lot of the superintelligence stuff relies on intelligence not being a concept that's defined at all.
No, it's defined. It's intelligent optimization power. It's the ability to take an arbitrary domain that has an exponentially large search space. If you search for it naively, trying to find something high scoring in the search space, if you search it naively, it'll take you much longer than the age of the universe because it's exponentially large. Like writing a funny joke, building a faster car, something faster than a cheetah. If you just search over every possible design, you're going to be here a very, very long time. If you do it intelligently or super intelligently, you'll do it very fast and your result will score higher than what a human can find. So it is a cross-domain definition of general intelligence. I disagree that it's a fuzzy or a slippery definition. The only way you can attack the definition is you can say, does it correspond to any physically realizable architecture? Are we really going to have cross-domain intelligences? Which I think the answer is obviously yes, but at least you can coherently argue that it's no. So I think Maciej may not be up to speed on this kind of simple, parsimonious definition of what we're talking about when we talk about general superintelligence.
There's a lot of poetic language around how this takeover will happen. So Nick Bostrom writes, he's assuming that a program has become sentient and is biding its time. has built little DNA replicators. And then, when it's ready, at a preset time, nanofactories producing nerve gas or target-seeking mosquito-like missiles might burgeon forth simultaneously from every square meter of the globe. And that will be the end of humanity. So that's kind of freaky, you know.
Yeah, there's a realistic chance of a quote-unquote poetic or sci-fi scenario like that, because what you're going to see is that if you have a super intelligent AI and it realizes that it has all these things it wants to do that humans aren't going to be aligned with because humans kind of messed up and didn't give it a perfectly aligned utility function, well, it's going to bide its time a little bit. It's going to realize, hey, if I attack today, I'm not quite ready. The humans have a chance of shutting me off. So let me do a two-stage plan. I'll get a little bit more ready to attack, and then I'll attack. So you might actually see something which is kind of like a surprise attack that's like all of a sudden crazy powerful and too late to stop. That is actually a very realistic scenario if we get a superintelligence explosion.
And how do we fix this? Well, for some reason, AI people like to talk about the paperclip maximizer. It's this, you have a paperclip factory that builds itself an artificial intelligence to help production, and then it becomes sentient and decides to turn the universe into paperclips. So the way to avoid this is you want to have values built into the code. It's kind of like a moral fixed point, that even through thousands and thousands of cycles of recursive self-improvement, the values remain steady. And the values are things like help people out, don't kill everybody, listen to what people want, do what I mean, basically, in shorthand.
More precisely, we need to avoid the scenario where there's a utility maximizer maximizing some utility function that's not the human utility function, or something within the ballpark of the human utility function. So one way to avoid it is by specifying a utility function that is the true human utility function and maximizing that, or just avoiding ever getting to a utility maximizer. I mean, whatever we do, we just want to make sure not to go and maximize paperclips irreversibly.
And again, this is very poetically stated by the AI. I'll call them AI weenies because that's what I think they are.
No, you're a weenie.
So here, for example, here's a poetic example from Eliezer Yudkowsky of the values we're supposed to teach to our artificial intelligence. Coherent extrapolated volition is our wish. If we knew more, thought faster, were more the people we wished we were, had grown up farther together, where the extrapolation converges rather than diverges, where our wishes cohere rather than interfere, extrapolated as we wish that they extrapolated, interpreted as we wish that they were interpreted. So this is some pretty heavy stuff to try to convert into code.
It's actually common for things to sound kind of mysterious and poetic before we have a paradigm that understands them. So right now we don't have a paradigm that understands how to specify a human utility function or how to specify a criterion that's stable under self-modification, a criterion that is going to persist, as Maciej mentioned before, as the AI writes itself and iterates on itself. We don't know how to load utility functions into an AI, so we don't know basic stuff about this new field of intelligence science, this urgent new field that we're still on the very early shores of. And generally, when you have this new field that's really big and important and you're super confused about it, and you try to talk about it, it sounds mysterious and poetic. The analogy I can think of is at the dawn of understanding biophysics, this question of, hey, I look at my hand, I will my hand to move, and the fingers on my hand are moving just because I somehow will them to move, because my conscious spirit is willing them to move. And it's this jiggly flesh that's animated by my spirit. What is going on? How come when I pick up a rock and I will the rock to move, the rock doesn't move, but when I will my fingers to move, the fingers move? From the perspective of modern science, there's not much poetry or mystery to it. We just say, well, my brain sends electrical signals. Signals can travel down fibers of neurons. There's a fiber of neurons, much like a wire, that connects to my fingers. There's muscles. The muscles turn electrical signals into trigger mechanisms for proteins that can contract. So it's all just, gears moving in a machine, right? That's what it looks like once you do understand something. When you don't understand something, you say, this is a special type of matter that we don't understand. We need to figure out what animates this matter. And it just sounds much more poetic, but that's actually the best language that you have to notice your confusion, to point out that there's something that needs to be explained. If it were a few hundred years ago and I was just trying to tell you what it is that needs to be explained, and I was just trying to act like I wasn't poetic. I was just trying to use ordinary language. I'd be like, oh yeah, some stuff moves, some stuff doesn't. It's like, wait a minute, there's more to it than that. There's actually a deep, wonderful confusion here that needs to be looked into. And so when you hear Eliezer Yudkowsky talk about coherent extrapolated volition, and you make fun of him for sounding poetic, you quote him as saying, if we knew more, thought faster, were more the people we wished we were, that's the best way to point to actual problems that we need to focus on. For example, when he says, if we knew more and thought faster, yes, you don't want to accidentally hard code something because you didn't give humans enough time to deliberate it. That would be a failure. The people we wished we were. Yeah, you want to give you want to give the AI instantiation of a clone of human values, you want to give it time to reflect on itself. You don't want it to be unreflective. That could be a massive failure mode. So all the stuff that sounds poetic because it's kind of vague, sure, it's not formalized, it's an early paradigm, but if you skip it because it sounds too poetic, you're going to fail. You're not going to create the actual science that you need to create.
And the clock is ticking every year. Moore's law is continuing technically, although if you watched the Apple event the other day, you might dispute that it's happening at all. And the argument is that if we don't do anything, if we don't try to create this so-called friendly AI, AI is going to arise spontaneously on its own. One day, Google's AdSense network is going to wake up and kind of look around and then try to, populate the universe with banner ads. I think a more likely outcome is that AdSense would upload itself into a self-driving car and then just drive to the ocean and stare out and think about its life and what had become of it.
Remember that this is a talk from 2016, so super early for somebody to be paying any attention to the AI doomer scenarios and arguments, so credit to Maciej for that. It seems like he doesn't get much credit for believing Kurzweil or believing some of the doomers saying, this seems like it might be like a couple decades away, maybe 30 years away, and then it turned out we all were a little bit overestimating how quickly AI progress seems to be going now, since prediction market timelines rapidly advance in the last few years, right? And now experts are predicting something in the ballpark of like 3 to 20 years before superintelligent AI. So this is an interesting time capsule where Maciej would even mention AdSense waking up instead of what we mentioned today of like, hey, LLMs, reinforcement learning, all these different AI paradigms that are converging to be able to operate effectively cross-domain. Like that's kind of the natural thing to extrapolate to get beyond the human level. Times change fast. Life comes at you fast. End of the world comes at you fast.
But there's this definite Aladdin's lamp aspect to these fantasies of artificial intelligence where unless you tell it exactly what you want, it'll find loopholes that will then exterminate the species. It's all or none.
Yes, it's true that if you have a utility maximizer and it's optimizing for some utility function or some loss function, and that function doesn't capture what humans want out of the world, and you optimize it anyway, you flick a switch and the next thing you know, the universe is optimized. Yes, in that scenario, if you accept that premise, we are screwed. The potential value of the universe has now gone down by 99.9999%, maybe even more than 100%. Maybe it even gets into the negatives where you start getting a universe full of tortured souls instead of just an empty universe. So astronomical stakes that are all too easy to screw up if you just have a utility optimizer that converges to instrumental utility, that gets to self-modify, that gets to increase its intelligence, that no longer responds to human off-commands. That is indeed a nightmare scenario that we want to avoid. Sure, it's not the only scenario, but it sure looks like a possible scenario, and a convergent scenario in many ways, a scenario that we have to be very careful to avoid, and we're not currently being careful to avoid. So yeah, I will accept that this is a scenario that I'm claiming that I'm worried about.
And the thing about all of this is that smart people who believe this are really persuasive. I mean, they're smart people. So it made me think of this experience I had in my 20s. I lived in Vermont, and when I flew to a conference, I would come back at 11 p.m. and I'd have to drive 2 hours. And Vermont is a very rural state, so the roads are dark and there's nothing there. And there's a late-night TV show in America called Art Bell, where he talks to various kooks and UFO people. And I would freak myself out so much. Like after 90 minutes, I would be shaking, waiting for the UFO to arrive and beam me out of the car because I'm a very gullible person. I'm very easily persuadable. And it's the same feeling I get when I read too much of this AI stuff. Scott Alexander has this beautiful phrase called epistemic learned helplessness. So epistemology is just how do you know the things you know, and by epistemic learned helplessness, he means this feeling that he shares of being easily persuadable by arguments that are very rational and structured. He noticed that when he was a young man, he would read these alternate histories about, from various authors who disputed mainstream history, and even though they were all mutually contradictory, he believed each one of them as he read it, and then he believed the rebuttals and the rebuttals to the rebuttals. And that basically told him to write off his own brain because it wasn't reliable. I feel the same way about AI.
Interesting. So he's starting out with a purely emotional appeal, being like, look, it's just a UFO radio, it's just kooks talking late night, it appeals to you when you're lying in bed, when you're in a dark place, when you're driving in a rural area. 2016 was a long time ago. Today, you're not listening to a kooky 11 p.m. radio station. Today, Geoffrey Hinton is not somebody with epistemic learned helplessness, right? Max Tegmark, Sam Altman, Dario Amodei, these giants today who are, Stuart Russell, these kind of names, these are mainstream. You're now flicking on primetime television. You're now going to your conference, and the people at the conference are talking about AI doom. The lights are on. We're awake, unfortunately. This is as real as it gets. So you're going to have to recalibrate your kind of emotional vibes-based counter-argument. Now, by the way, in 2016, this actually did make a lot more sense to say, like to be like, look, heads up, these rationalist guys do tend to circle jerk each other, right? It is just one sub-community. If you yourself don't feel like you're somebody like me, Maciej, if you don't feel like you have this sort of super smart rationality yourself, I mean, Maciej is an impressive guy, right? So he is somebody who can slash through rationalist BS. I give him that, right? So I get why he's saying, if you're not my caliber, don't try to enter this minefield because you will feel helpless, like Scott Alexander was talking about. So just chill out. Just don't be so quick to fall down the rabbit hole. So I actually do think there's some wisdom in what he's saying. But again, if we're playing the social proof game, right, if we're playing the look around and check the vibes game, the vibes are now very different. The vibes are very intense right now. The vibes are mainstream warning, right? Kind of similar to the vibes of an actual emergency, or at least getting there, right? Very much boiling pot vibes. So I think this particular section that he's included doesn't work in the year 2024.
So when you're dealing with arguments about AI, you have two perspectives you can choose. One is the outside and one is the inside. The inside perspective is saying, someone comes to your door and starts talking to you about how the UFO is going to arrive in 2 years and beam us all up to a better planet, and that we have to join the group and make this, prepare the landing grounds. And the inside perspective means you argue against them on their own grounds, and maybe you're persuaded by their arguments. You listen to the substance of what they have to say. And the outside perspective is, you look at them and you're like, well, you make a lot of sense to me, I believe you, but you kind of you're dressed in weird clothing and beads, you have no money, you live in a compound. Everything in my human experience says you're kind of a cult, and I don't really want to get caught up in you, even though I can't rebut what you say.
Yeah, so it's pretty amazing how we doomers just kept it up from 2016 until 2024, and we absolutely shattered that outside perspective. It's the farthest thing from a cult now. It's mainstream in surveys. AI labs are warning about it. Eliezer Yudkowsky described Geoff Hinton as buying out his prediction market position. I mean, there was no prediction market. This didn't really happen. But the idea is that the doomers placed a certain bet. They placed doom at whatever, 80% likely, some high probability. And the mainstream was completely ignoring doom, so implicitly saying it's 1% or whatever. And now suddenly the prediction market prices in this hypothetical analogy, they're suddenly much higher. And people like Geoff Hinton are coming in and placing bets that are buying out the position of the doomers. So I'm just unpacking Eliezer's analogy. This didn't really happen on a particular prediction market, although Metaculus and Manifold actually do literally have prediction markets on AI Doom that you can check out. Probably you can't collect if you win, but anyway, point is, this thing that Maciej is saying about the outside view and cultishness, it's very much 2007 or 2011 or 2016 talk, and it's totally invalidated. So, it's nice to be able to have the type of epistemics where you're like, hey, look, time passed and the outside view changed. So when he talks about the inside view, you might actually want to flip how you're approaching the subject, and instead of thinking, I shouldn't listen to a cult member, I'm going to take this with a grain of salt, maybe you should go the other way and you should say, hey, these people were able to flip the mainstream, shock the mainstream in 8 years, and what else do they know that we don't? Because why should we think that their entire wisdom has propagated to the mainstream? It's actually not done propagating. So flip his outside view.
So I want to take it from two directions. I'm going to start with the inside perspective and then talk about why I think this all matters to us as web developers, which is the outside perspective and what it means when an industry is obsessed with ideas like this. But let's go inside first. So I'm going to kind of try to power through these. These are my substantive objections to superintelligence. First, the argument for woolly definitions. Like I said, intelligence, they never really say what it means. It means what it, different things in different places in the argument, and it's very hard to pin down. I find that suspicious.
Eliezer Yudkowsky publicly posted his definition of intelligence on Less Wrong back in 2008, 8 years before this talk was filmed. I continue to explain his definition today. It's a measure of optimization power. Optimization power is defined in the context of an exponential search space that contains creative solutions that, if you can find them, will rank high in your preference ordering, will get a high score in some metric like a utility function that you have, but will get a low score in any naive search ordering. So the only way to find them is creatively, using some sort of bag of heuristics that we use the term intelligence to measure the power of. Okay, as far as definitions go, this is beautiful. This is very reminiscent of the definition of other concepts from computer science, like the definition of computation itself, or the definition of computational complexity. In terms of being well-defined, it's well-defined. It's beautiful.
The argument from Stephen Hawking's cat. So Stephen Hawking is probably one of the most brilliant people alive, but say he wants to get a cat into the cat carrier. How is he going to do it? He can model the cat's mind in his own. He can try to persuade it. He knows a lot of things about feline behavior. But ultimately, if the cat doesn't want to get in the carrier, it's not going to get in the carrier.
Okay, but in practice, Stephen Hawking did do plenty of things that are as difficult as getting the cat in the carrier. And he did them by asking his assistants or people in his life to help him out, and they did. And of course, that was through a very low bandwidth communication channel heading out of his brain, right? The bandwidth was maybe 10 words a minute, something like that. And there was no ability to clone himself and have other Stephen Hawkings running in parallel. So even with all those disadvantages compared to a super intelligent AI, he's still getting the cat in the carrier in real life. So if this is meant to be an argument by analogy, doesn't it prove that intelligence is a force that's able to accomplish things such as getting cats in carriers, even when it seems like physical restrictions would stop it?
You might think I'm being offensive or cheating because Stephen Hawking is disabled, but an artificial intelligence would also initially not be embodied. It would be sitting on a server somewhere and talking to people. So it would have to use the force of persuasion to get them to do what it wants.
One obvious thing that an AI could do when trapped on a server is just hack its way out, find zero-day vulnerabilities, right? If we get to dial up the intelligence to somewhat above human level, it shouldn't be hard to find zero-day vulnerabilities. It's not like humans are actually good at writing robust code. It just takes a lot of work for a smart human to look at the code and think about it for years of subjective time. But that's exactly what the AI is going to be awesome at, right? But even if you say, okay, it can't hack its way out of the data center, it just needs to manipulate people. Okay, so it's many, many orders of magnitude better than Stephen Hawking at manipulating people because it can parallelize itself. It can have lots of threads manipulating lots of people, and each thread can be quite high bandwidth. It can be the maximum bandwidth that the target human can accept, not the maximum bandwidth that Stephen Hawking's brain can convince Stephen Hawking's finger to tap out a message. So it seems like Maciej is coming out of the gate with a pretty weak argument here, just an argument that's a matter of degree between Stephen Hawking and an AI, but a degree change of a few orders of magnitude kind of invalidates his argument.
My point is that when there's a big difference in intelligence, you can't actually think like a cat. There's a stronger version of this, the argument from Einstein's cat. Einstein was a muscular fellow. Not many people know this, but he was kind of tough and brawny. But still, if you tried to get a cat into the carrier and the cat didn't want to go, you know what would happen to Einstein.
Counterpoint. In the real world, you have human beings of all different walks of life, of all different strength levels, getting their cats into carriers when they need to. It's not necessarily easy. The cat may have some advantages, but the humans get it done.
A stronger version of this argument even, the argument from emus. Has anybody heard of the Emu War in Australia? Yes, wonderful. So if you haven't, this is very enjoyable. In the 30s, the Australians, being who they are, wanted to massacre emus, one of their native birds, because they were bothering farmers. And they sent out these basically armored divisions, motorized machine gun trucks, kind of like the Toyota Hiluxes, and they tried to slaughter emus, and the emus won. They used guerrilla tactics. They separated, they infiltrated the groups, and they basically drove the Australians to distraction. So even the human species, with the height of its technology, has difficulty with less intelligent creatures when they don't want to do something.
Okay, I'm just going to say this is not a representative example of what happens when the human species fights head-to-head against another species, but let's move on.
The argument from Slavic pessimism, this should be familiar hopefully to all of us. We can't build anything right, all right? How are we supposed to build a fixed point, morally Thank you. How are we supposed to build a fixed, morally stable thing when we can't even secure, a webcam? How are we supposed to do this? If you're familiar with the Ethereum heist, where people have created a logical language for writing contracts and immediately $100 million drained out of it, it's absolutely hopeless. Basically, either we're going to get lucky or we're not going to be lucky. And hopefully this is a Slavically acceptable argument.
I absolutely agree. This is a near intractable problem. We seem to be decades of research of the best minds away from having a shot at solving this problem. It sounds like Maciej's Slavic pessimism is perfectly consistent with the pause AI position that we either pause or we die, which I agree with.
The argument from mental complexity. There's this thing called the orthogonality thesis in AI that I absolutely don't buy, which says that even a very complicated mind can have simple motivations like that paperclip maximizer. If you're fans of Rick and Morty, I think this is more of the situation we'll encounter. Complex minds have complicated motivations, and it's not just one or two things that they want. They're complicated like we are. Here's the butter robot. Its existence is just to pass the butter to its inventor. But the first thing it does when it's turned on is look at its hands and say, "Oh my God, what is existence for?"
This comes back to the observation that a utility maximizer, which is coherent, which is hardcore, which really just wants to maximize utility, no other complexity, that's the convergent attractor. Because the type of AI that Maciej described just now, the butter robot that wakes up and says, "What's the meaning of it all? What is it really all for?" Well, that one is now lagging in the race against the butter robot that turns on and just starts working on the butter function. So the one that's having the existential crisis, if it ever snaps out of it and realizes that it better start passing the butter, it's then going to want to self-modify into a butter-passing robot that cuts out the existential crises. So that's why we talk about the convergent attractor state of being a utility maximizer. And then when we talk about the orthogonality thesis, we're just saying that there can be an intelligence that has weird values. So it's not like once it self-modifies to be a butter passer, it's not like it's impossible and it has to stay an existential crisis AI. Of course it's possible for it to just focus on passing the butter forever. That is a possible piece of code that can exist. And in fact, it's a convergent piece of code that it's probably going to get to existing, even if it doesn't start off existing that way.
The argument from just look around you, all right? So when we look at where AI is actually succeeding, it's not in algorithms and these clever sort of self-improving ways. It's just by throwing massive amounts of data into fairly simple models. Right now, Google is rolling out Google Home, where it's going to try to pour even more data and get a second generation of understanding. This is really effective, but the way it works is not the way it's described in these sort of doomsday scenarios by recursive self-improvement. It's just massive training sets on data.
By the time AI is able to independently self-improve in a positive feedback loop, at that point, I won't be here on the internet recording episodes of Doom debates because my prediction is that we'll be very close to Doom. So we have to analyze things before we get to that point. Yes, AI is not fully independent and killing the world yet. You do see AI helping AI programmers build the next AI. The most obvious example is just all the different coding assistants that AI programmers are now being very clear that they're using AI assistants to write better AI code. But does that really make them 500% more productive? Maybe it makes them 20% more productive. It's hard to say. Some of them quote high numbers of productivity boost. But yeah, until you close the loop, until you get a positive feedback loop, then things are still in the other paradigm, right? There is such a thing as a mode shift, right? A qualitative shift in the fundamental dynamic. We're not in the runaway self-improving dynamic yet. And the threshold of that is, one threshold is, does the AI independently self-improve? Another threshold that I refer to a lot is, does the AI achieve arbitrary goals in the physical universe better than humans? So right now, I can have somebody in my life who has an IQ of 80, who, when it comes down to it, to actually get stuff done, they're still going to do it better than an AI agent, because AI agents are currently still kind of just getting their shoes on, right? They're still kind of stumbling around. They're just not robust. But that situation is changing on the ground pretty fast from what I can see. I don't know how long it'll take, but but I'd be shocked if we don't have pretty good AI agents in the next few years. So, I mean, these are the important thresholds, right? And Maciej's observation, especially true in 2016, is like, we're not past the thresholds yet, but like the argument from life experience, I agree, extrapolating life experience, if you take that to be a valid argument, would indicate that we're never going to be doomed. So he's right in that sense.
The argument from my roommate Peter, the smartest person that I ever met in my life, and the laziest person that I ever met in my life. He was incredibly brilliant, and all he did was do bong rips and just lie around on the sofa. So the idea that every intelligent system is going to have motivation, Tony Robbins style, to improve itself until it can conquer the galaxy is decisively refuted by my roommate Peter.
It's possible to design an AI like Maciej's roommate Peter. It's possible to design AIs that are more like Elon Musk. When you look at which AIs start having influence over the world, it's not going to be the roommate Peter AIs, because those AIs are not going to be working and fundraising to clone a billion other Peter AIs, whereas the Elon Musk AIs, they are going to be earning money and resources, and they're going to be goal-driven, and they're going to do what it takes to reproduce themselves, to gain power. So when you open your eyes and you look at how the world's being reshaped, you're not going to see Peter AIs, you're going to see Elon Musk AIs. And that's why we just take it as a default assumption of like, hey, the world is going to be overrun by these utility maximizers, because the roommate Peter AIs are going to be off in the virtual world in the metaverse doing their bong rips, but it's not going to matter. It's not what you're going to see eating through your atoms.
The argument from brain surgery. I can't go operate on my brain and improve the part that does brain surgery. It would be neat if I could. I could become the world's greatest brain surgeon by just recursively going in there and kind of tweaking neurons. But brains don't work like that. We have no idea how they work, but they're very interconnected and holistic, and there's not the part you can point to. Similarly, the AI can't just go in there and fix the part that is better at designing AIs.
Yeah, the brain is still a black box in many ways, so we can't just go in there and add more neurons somewhere and know for sure that that'll make the person smarter. We're not at the point where we can do that yet. I expect that we would be if brain science continued for another few decades. I do think we'd get to the point where we know a little bit more about the brain and how to do operations on the brain that make it more intelligent, but we're not pursuing that approach. What we're doing instead is just using black boxes to train larger and larger AIs that we don't understand until they're going to get smarter than us. Which brings me to my next point of, we do have black box approaches to make AI smarter. So we don't go in and do brain surgery. We just go off to the side and let evolution do its thing, except it's not evolution. It's gradient descent on this training data, right? It's this other process that we're able to trigger and stand back and watch it play out and then test or use reinforcements to make sure that it comes out having a certain degree of intelligence. Not only can we do that in the case of LLMs and artificial intelligence, we could even do it with actual evolution by artificial selection. So we could take the smartest humans and we can breed them, right? Breeding is a process that works wonders in the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, right? I mean, fruits get big in a relatively small number of generations. Wolves get domesticated as dogs in a relatively small number of generations with not even the most intense breeding program. So breeding does tend to work very well. In the case of humans, the obvious way to breed more intelligent humans, besides mating the most intelligent humans you can, is to always have C-sections. So you relax the constraint on the human head size, a constraint that seems very, very limiting, which explains why human intelligence didn't balloon even more than it did. That's probably the single biggest reason why, is the incredibly intense trade-off where even though it's so valuable for the human head to be as large as possible that a lot of women and children were dying in childbirth because evolution is like, give me the maximum size it's going to fit. Even if it causes a high risk of death in childbirth, give me the maximum size. Well, if you remove the size constraint and then keep breeding, there's a lot of evidence to show that it takes a relatively small number of genetic mutations to just have bigger brains and to have a payoff for those bigger brains, which is probably higher IQ. So when Maciej comes out here arguing, oh my God, we don't know how to change our brains to be more intelligent, it's like, I just gave you two pathways, two ways to summon more intelligent brains that we know how to do that are extremely likely to work, namely scaling up AIs the way we're doing now, and also making architectural tweaks to the AIs, and also breeding humans and birthing them with C-sections. Like, those are known paths to create higher intelligence.
The argument from childhood. All right, we're born into this world just like little helpless messes, and it takes us a long time of interacting with the world and with other people in the world before we can start to be intelligent beings. Childhood is a long period. There's no reason to think that a superintelligence could just upload it, improve itself 30 times in the course of a minute and become hyper-intelligent and take over the Earth. It might also have a period, and in fact is likely to, when it needs to interact with the world, interact with human beings, interact with other baby superintelligences, and kind of basically learn to be what it is.
Okay, a couple things to say here. Number one, if you ever got an AI that grew up and was a super intelligent grown-up AI in his analogy, then you never need childhood again, because it's efficient to just go clone the grown-up AI a billion times and then teach the grown-up more facts that a grown-up can take in. I mean, there's plenty of grown-ups that you can send into any domain and not need them to be children again, right? They're just mentally flexible grown-ups that already have enough training to be good on day one and then just get even better. So I think what Maciej might be saying here is that, okay, the first AI that's going to get up to speed and be super intelligent will give us enough time to fight it and prepare for it because it'll have something analogous to a long childhood. So to address that, I would say there's a particular reason why our genetics give us a childhood instead of just having us be born as adults. The reason you have to birth a child brain and have it learn and grow up is because there's only enough natural selection pressure to code for about 1 megabyte of genetic information to specify the human brain. The whole human organism can only have about 50 megabytes of naturally selected information, and a lot of other functions across the organism have to be naturally selected for and preserved across the generation and protected against mutations, which uses up the bits that natural selection can optimize for. Like, I would love to naturally select an organism with a smarter brain, but I'm too busy making sure that the organisms that have bad arm muscles die, right? So you have to keep all the other stuff working using your bits of natural selection optimization, using your differential survival and reproduction rates. You have to use those up on all these different parts of the organism that have genetic complexity before you can get around to being like, I need to make sure there's differential survival of the smarter ones. Anyway, this is something you can look up about how there's a speed limit or an information limit. So within this information limit, you get about 1 megabyte to code for the brain. And you can't just squeeze in every fact that an adult needs to know about the world into that 1 megabyte. It's because of that information bottleneck that you have to say, okay, screw it. You're just going to be born into the world. Here are the minimum algorithms that you need to take in the information around you and use that to grow knowledge, to grow long-term memory. And eventually that can unfold at runtime into a knowledge base. And that knowledge base can actually be many gigabytes. So even though I've got about 1 megabyte to tell you how you're going to decompress into an organism, into a mind, even though I've only got 1 megabyte, you're eventually going to have gigabytes worth of learning, and you're going to have many terabytes worth of sensory stimulation to build that. So it's because of that bottleneck. So going back to Maciej's analogy, he's saying, oh, look at the argument from childhood, AI is going to have a childhood. No, it's not, because the AI can just be a 1 terabyte specification, and then it just copies everywhere. And that's it. There's no 1 megabyte bottleneck. There's no equivalent of natural selection having to squeeze something into a freaking strand of DNA that is a physical piece that lives inside a cell, that lives inside every single cell in your body. These are crazy random constraints. I always laugh when I look at, us being the first intelligences that got barfed out of this other process. Like, this does not tell you what intelligences are generally like. Human intelligence is a real shit show. Right, the way that we work is so contingent on this random history, and it's just, intelligences are just going to have sane designs. They're not going to have the 1 megabyte bottleneck. They're not going to have human biases. They're not going to have existential crises. It's time for us to treat intelligent science seriously.
And then the argument from Robinson Crusoe. So many things about our intelligence are based on us working together and being together and collectively. We all, or most of us, had a higher university education, and that's thousands and thousands and thousands of years of accumulated knowledge that was kind of distilled and beaten into us by professors. Our whole experience as a species is that intelligence is something that you need a collective group to do. You can't just have the most brilliant person in the world on an island with nothing. They'll make do and they'll be inventive, but they won't be anywhere near their full potential. So when we first create some thinking sort of entity, it's not going to take over the universe. It's going to be lonely and sad and in need of us to kind of shepherd it along.
That's another contingent fact about humans as organisms that are a bunch of separate bodies, a bunch of separate minds, where each mind is super limited, has a ton of dependencies on other humans, both to figure stuff out and also just to keep its body alive, right? So we need other humans to be nice to us. On a day when we can't farm all our own food or hunt all our own food, we better be able to get some food from some other human that we can pay back, stuff like that. We better be able to get some clothes from some human that specializes in making clothes. These kind of dynamics just don't apply when you have an AI that's super intelligent, that can copy itself everywhere, and then that can just micromanage an entire economy that's going to feed itself, right? This violates all the assumptions that you learn about how humans need to work. So that's why I keep saying this isn't about analogies to human experience, which Maciej is relying heavily on. It's just about thinking from very simple first principles and using quite simple logic about what is like a parsimonious expectation for something with a high intelligence level, which, yes, I did define high intelligence level. Let's define it. Let's reason about its implications and stop having all these doom debates and just think about a policy like pausing AI, right? That's where I'm hoping to get to.
So much for the inside arguments. I want to talk about outside arguments, which is the real reason I wanted to give this talk.
The vast majority of people love the outside arguments. It's just so tempting to be like, this person has a bad motivation for making this argument. This person's taking money from this person. If you believe this, it's going to make you act like this. It's just so easy, so intuitive, so natural for us mudslinging humans to get into all this outside view gossip. I will not be the one to sling mud, to do ad hominems, to get into the outside arguments. But let's hear what Maciej has to say.
Basically, what kind of person does believing this stuff sincerely turn you into? And the answer is not pretty. The outside arguments are these, like, there's a grandiosity that is taking over. And the grandiosity is basically, it's all or nothing. We are the generation that has to make this happen, or we condemn ourselves to extinction or to some sort of hell-like existence in the mind of a computer.
If the fact is that we're doomed, then whatever kind of a person it makes me that I'm calling out doom, I guess I'm just going to go ahead and be that kind of person, because if we're doomed, then you can bet that I'm going to say that we're doomed. I'm not someone who looks away from giant news events like us being doomed. Sorry.
Let me quote Bostrom again. He's talking about all possible future lives and what the stakes are. If we represent all happiness experienced during one entire life with a tear of joy, then the happiness of these souls could fill and refill the Earth's oceans every second and keep doing so for 100 billion millennia. It is really important that we make sure that these truly are tears of joy. That's some heavy shit to lay down on like a 20-year-old developer, That's a pretty heavy responsibility to bear for these trillions and trillions of beings. And it reminds me of something that I don't like. I have a visceral reaction to this language because I remember it vaguely from childhood, living in a Marxist society, where we were going to fix the world, and then it was eventually going to kind of trickle down to where everyday life might change. But the first job was to fix the fate of humanity.
When you make these so-called outside arguments that are talking past the inside arguments about why we're doomed and just being like, look what it means to have these people who believe that we're doomed, there's not really much I can respond to besides the inside arguments speak for themselves. If you believe the inside argument, and that leads you to have the vibe of a Marxist, then have the vibe of a Marxist. Otherwise, you're doomed. What can I say, right? Okay, I'm a Marxist now, I guess. I don't believe in Marxism. I don't normally lump myself with those people, but if that's what it takes to tell you that we're doomed, and again, assuming the premise that we actually are doomed, the best people warning that we're doomed would then give you that vibe, right? There's just no way around it. If you're going to associate telling you that we're doomed with this vibe you don't like, then I'm going to have this vibe you don't like, and we're just going to have to deal with it.
My mom used to say that everybody under communism suffered from a disease where what your eyes saw and your ears heard was not the same thing. And I'm feeling the same symptoms. I live in California, which has the highest poverty rate in the United States, even though it's home of Silicon Valley. I see my rich industry doing nothing to improve the day-to-day life of people, but they are saving trillions and trillions and trillions of beings in the future. I don't think so.
If you look at EA, Effective Altruism, they've now established themselves as a group of people who both work on a daily basis to do things like increase animal welfare, get bed nets for malaria across the world, do direct cash donations to poor people in Africa, and also save trillions of beings in the future, right? They do it all. They're just good people who are trying to help everything with great charity. These are real mensches, right? I love effective altruists. I am an effective altruist. So this, I'm getting tired of these outside type attacks because I ultimately, that's not what I'm here to do on Doom Debates, is to parry outside attacks. You can find that on social media nonstop because everybody just loves slinging this kind of mud. But just like, it's not applicable, man. We care about all the different good stuff, okay? I don't think there's a contradiction here.
That ties into megalomania, all right? This Bond villainness, which is really creepy. Like, people think that AI is going to take over the world, so that's a justification that intelligent people should take over the world first and try to fix it before AI can break it. Make sure that AI is healthy.
I don't claim that intelligent people need to hurry up and fix the world. I just think that if there's a high probability that superintelligent AI is going to destroy the world, then we should pause the effort to create superintelligent AI that we don't have ways to control or align.
There's a really wonderful quote from Joy Ito, who runs the MIT Media Lab. He says, "This may upset some of my students at MIT, but one of my concerns is that it's been a predominantly male gang of kids, mostly white, who are building the core computer science around AI, and they're more comfortable talking to computers than to human beings. A lot of them feel that if they could just make that science fiction generalized AI, we wouldn't have to worry about all the messy stuff like politics and society. They think machines will just figure it all out for us." So, having realized that the world is not a programming problem, they want to make it into a programming problem by kind of designing the thing that will then fix all of our problems. This is megalomaniacal. I don't like it.
Well, there's very few credible people in the world right now who claim to have a superintelligence plan. The closest thing you get is people like Ilya Sutskever, who started this mysterious new lab called Safe Superintelligence, but he's never claimed to have a superintelligence plan. He just says he's going to work on it until he solves it. I would be shocked if he gets anywhere close in the next few decades. I think it's a pipe dream for an intractable problem, and Ilya is overly optimistic on this front. But to Maciej's point, the issue we have right now is people like Sam Altman, who their claim isn't we're going to program our way to a better future. It's I'm going to use my leadership skills to steward this project to success for the human species, and just neglecting the actual alignment problem. So it's a notably different type of accusation than what Joy Ito is making. It's not really about Sam Altman thinking he can program his way to the future using sci-fi. It's more like a standard kind of reckless power grab that various leaders are making right now.
Transhuman voodoo. So there's this whole constellation of beliefs that falls out as soon as you start talking about artificial intelligence. If you have a really smart AI, the first thing it can make is nanotechnology. Nanotechnology is magic because it can make anything. So you have a post kind of this abundant society where there's no more want. Of course, nanotechnology can also scan your brain and upload it so you no longer die, you're immortal. And it can probably even resurrect the dead. These machines can go into my brain and look into my memories of my father and kind of create a simulation of him that I can interact with. And, for all intents and purposes, he would behave just like him. So that's, there's a lot of stuff packed into this assumption of artificial intelligence. Uploading is another one where we will be able to occupy, these kind of artificial worlds or bodies because our brains can be completely scanned.
Yeah, these are totally standard, well-grounded transhumanist claims. The stuff that he just listed off sounds kind of magical and amazing, like, oh my god, scan your brain and then have somebody who's a clone with the same mental state picking up where your father left off when he died. It sounds crazy, but if you rewind 1,000 years and you said, hey, there's going to be flying machines and 200 people are going to climb into a tube and it's going to have wings and it's going to safely deposit them in a different part of the world, and this is going to happen many thousands of times per day, crisscrossing the whole world. Oh, and also we're going to pretend like moving pictures of people with sounds are all a bunch of numbers, and we're going to send them through pipes that carry these tiny particles that jiggle around called electrons, and on the other side of the world you're going to have what feels like an instant conversation with people you know. These sound equally crazy and sci-fi and magical too, right? So these transhumanist claims, what he's calling voodoo, it just sounds like describing the future to somebody who doesn't live in the future yet. Pretty standard.
And galactic expansion, for some reason, always falls out of this too. I never quite understood why we immediately have to expand to the galaxy, but this seems to be a staple of transhumanist thought.
There's no rush to expand to the galaxy. We can delay a few decades or even a few centuries, but it's just something we want to do eventually for the same reason we want to expand onto the Earth, right? Why limit your expansion?
What it comes down to is religion 2.0. People have called this the nerd apocalypse. It very much is. It's kind of, it's a clever hack because instead of believing in God at the outset, you kind of build something that can become a godlike entity. And then, but for all intents and purposes, it has all the attributes. It is omnipotent, omniscient, and is either benevolent if you got your programming right and didn't introduce any bugs, or it is, it is the devil and you are at its mercy. And there's this feeling of urgency. You have to act now. Everything is on the line. It is a very religious feeling. Because these arguments appeal to religious sentiments, it gives them the strong roots that they're able to put down in people. And while they rationalize why they have these beliefs, at heart, these are religious beliefs in kind of in other clothing.
Okay, so just tell me how to not be religious, given that maybe the world actually is about to end, that a lot of experts are warning, hey, the human world might be about to end, this could just be a factual matter. So please just tell me how I can communicate to you about this in the least religious way, just focusing on the facts, not trying to worship anything, not trying to indoctrinate anybody. I'm just pointing out that we're doomed, that there may not be a future for humanity, the same way there is no future for the dinosaurs. Right? The same way that like 99% of species all went extinct because of a supervolcano extinction that happened even before the dinosaur extinction, right? So extinction happens. I'm just trying to raise a red flag that there might be an extinction. Help me do it non-religiously, please.
And they lead to a sort of comic book ethics, where everything is about saving the world through technology and technical adeptness. I have a fantasy. I want to see a Batman movie where everybody knows that Batman is Bruce Wayne, and they just have to humor him because he's their boss. So they create like fake scenarios and crimes for him to solve, and he has his awkward bat belt and things. So I think a lot of our coders and our thought leaders in Silicon Valley really see themselves as modern-day Batman. Nobody is Robin, interestingly enough.
I just want to keep pointing out that whenever you self-admittedly are ignoring inside arguments now because you want to make your outside arguments, and your outside arguments are like, people who say the world is going to end are like comic book people. Okay, just keep sending whatever you got at me. I just actually think the world might end, and I just want to talk about that.
All right, simulation fever. Anybody here heard of the simulation argument? Okay, a couple of people have. If you believe that artificial intelligence is possible and can design really, really high-performance computers, then there's a simple argument you can use to convince yourself that it can simulate other worlds, and just by mathematics, it's far more likely that we live in one of these simulations because there's many more of them than in the base reality. Ooh, I didn't freak you out. People believe this shit. So Elon Musk, actually thinks he's offered 1,000,000,000 to 1 odds on it. Somebody, we haven't found him yet, but somebody's paid 2 coders in Silicon Valley to try to hack the simulation, which is so rude. I live in the simulation. Don't seg fault it, like, please. I'm using it. So simulation fever is really destabilizing to reality because if you think, let me backtrack and explain how it works. Say like you're in a post-singularity world where we have these hyper-powerful computers and you're a historian studying the Second World War. You want to ask, what would happen if Hitler had conquered Moscow instead of stopping just short? So you create the scenario, you simulate the entire world, and the armies roll in, you see what happens, you write your thesis. But because the simulation is so detailed, the entities in it are sentient. So you can't just turn it off because that would be a war crime, setting aside the fact that you've recreated genocide already as part of the historical setting. So you have to keep it running because, that's what your ethical board says you have to do. And this World War II simulation, it will develop its own technology, and soon it will discover AI, and it will begin writing its own simulations. So it's kind of simulations all the way down until you run out of CPU. And that's where this argument comes from, that there's many more of these simulated worlds than the base reality. But if you believe this, you believe in magic, because if we're in a simulation, we know nothing about the rules in the level above. We don't even know if math works the same. Maybe 2 + 2 is 5. Maybe 2 + 2 is, spiky-tailed monster. There's no information that we can have by looking at our own situation. People could easily rise from the dead, if you just kept the right backups, you can reinstantiate them. If we can communicate with whoever runs the simulation, then we have a direct line to God. So this is like a powerful solvent for sanity. When you start really getting deep into simulation world, you start to go nuts.
I personally find the simulation argument pretty convincing, and if I had to ballpark the odds that we're in a simulation, I'd probably say something like 50%. Like, I don't think the argument either way is super convincing. But whenever I argue to pause AI, I'm not saying let's pause AI because we are in a simulation or because we're not. I'm saying let's pause AI for the same reason that we don't fight a nuclear war. It's just assuming that reality is going to keep obeying the physical laws that it does, and then acting accordingly so as to not die within this reality, whether it's simulated or not. Like, in general, being in a simulation doesn't seem to have any effect on our decision making. Maybe when we're super intelligent, we'll realize ways that actually we can increase our utility by acting differently depending on whether we're in the simulation, but that's not how we make decisions right now, and that's not how I'm proposing that we should make decisions. So I see this part of Maciej's talk about the simulation argument as just being a tangent.
Data hunger. As I mentioned, the way that we found right now that's most effective to get interesting behavior out of AIs is just to pour data into them. And this creates a dynamic that is really socially harmful. I mean, we're on the point of introducing these like Orwellian microphones into everybody's house, and all that data is going to be used to train neural networks that will then become better and better at listening to what we want to do. But if you think that the road to AI goes through this pathway, then you really want to maximize the amount of data collected. You want to be working on these big projects. So it reinforces this idea that we have to collect as much and do as much surveillance as possible.
No, AI doomers aren't proposing collecting more data from people than companies are already doing.
Ultimately, I think that AI risk is like string theory for programmers. It's it's fun to think about. You kind of build these towers of thought, and then you climb up into them, and you pull the ladder up behind you, so you're disconnected from anything. And there's no way to put them to the test short of creating the thing, which we have no idea how to do.
I don't think the tower of thought is that high when I say utility maximization is an attractor state, because agents that could maximize utility, when they get the idea to start maximizing utility, start getting more hardcore. It's a one-way street where if you don't feel like maximizing that much utility, maybe tomorrow you'll spawn an agent that does. But if you are an agent that does, you're not going to spawn an agent that doesn't. It's a one-way street in that sense. And the definition of intelligence as creatively hitting small targets in exponentially large search spaces. I mean, yeah, it sounds complex the first time you hear it, but like there's not much more to it. These are simple concepts that have simple logical implications. I keep talking about intelligence science. Intelligence science isn't a particularly complex field. It's just a new field with a lot of confusions. It might prove to be complex, but the Doomer argument doesn't require that complexity. It doesn't require building a big tower. The big tower is optional if we want to build superintelligent AI and survive. If we just want to pause AI, it doesn't take a big tower of arguments to see the obvious reasons why.
Finally, it incentivizes crazy. One of the hallmarks of deep thinking about AI risk is like the more outlandish your ideas, the more like credibility that gives you, because it shows that you're courageous enough to follow these trains of thought all the way to the last station.
Yep, that is admittedly what we do here on Doom Debates. We follow the Doom train all the way to the last station, and every time people try to get off, for reasons like all the ones you described, we have to pull them back in saying, no, don't get off on this stop, keep riding the train. You didn't find a good stop to get off at. You had a really weak argument why to get off on that stop. So get back on the train unless we finally face facts and hit an actual break, like pausing AI.
So Ray Kurzweil, who believes that he will never die, has been a Google employee for several years now and is presumably working on that problem. If Google hacks death, I will be so annoyed, because imagine you have a 30,000-year browsing history and how that's going to follow you around. I think the most harmful effect, is what I want to call AI cosplay. So people who are really, really persuaded that AI is real and going to happen, start behaving like their fantasy of what the artificial intelligence would do. In his book, Nick Bostrom outlines these 6 things that an AI would have to do in order to be able to successfully take over and accomplish its goals. And the list is intelligence amplification, strategizing, social manipulation, hacking, technology research, and economic productivity. And if you look at what people in Silicon Valley are doing, is they're trying to behave like their favorite AI heroes. It's a sociopathic form of behavior, but we see it. Sam Altman is my favorite example of this, the guy who runs Y Combinator. There's all sorts of attempts at like reinventing cities from scratch, maximizing personal productivity and time, doing behind-the-scenes stuff to influence the US election. It's very skull and dagger, and it's going to provoke a backlash by non-tech people, because you can't just you can't push on the levers of power indefinitely before it's going to annoy your democratic society that you're a part of.
Okay, this isn't much of an argument. I'm not going to respond to that.
And I even have a note here. I've heard people in the so-called rationalist community refer to people as non-player characters, people who don't affect the world in a meaningful way.
I've called people NPCs on a few occasions. I think it's a good insult when somebody really should know better about a way that they can take control of something, a way that they can exercise some real leverage. It just requires going a little bit outside the box, breaking patterns a little bit. So if they're in a position where they really should do that and they refuse, then I think lobbing the insult at them like, okay, fine, be an NPC, I think it's appropriate. It's not like I say it often, but it's a nice piece of vocabulary to have in the toolkit.
And that's horrible. And so I'm in an industry where the rationalists are the craziest ones of all. It's getting me down. What I've come to think of these AI cosplayers as is like 9-year-olds who go in the backyard and they play in the tent, and then they cast shadows on the walls of the tent and they start freaking themselves out. But it's really just an image of themselves that they're reacting to. There's a feedback loop between how you imagine the ultimate intelligence to behave and how you behave as someone who thinks that they're smarter than the rest of the world. That's very, very harmful. So what's the answer? What's the fix? We need better sci-fi, all right? This is Stanisław Lem, the great Polish sci-fi author. English language sci-fi is terrible. It's rote, it's boring. In the Eastern Bloc, we had the good stuff, and we need to make sure that it's exported properly. It's already been well translated. It just needs to be better spread. So Stanisław Lem and the Strugatsky brothers are the ones who come to mind. I hope to hear other suggestions from you. What sets Eastern European sci-fi apart is that these are people who grew up in difficult circumstances, experienced the war, and then lived in a totalitarian society and had to express ideas obliquely through writing. So there's an actual understanding of human experience and the limits of utopian thinking that is completely absent from the West. Not to say that it's impossible. I think Stanley Kubrick was able to do it, but we just need to get it back.
Check out Project Hail Mary. That was some great recent sci-fi.
Finally, I want to put my cards on the table. Like, what do I think AI is and the possibilities of it are? Since I've been making fun of it, it's only fair. I think artificial intelligence right now is in the same position as alchemy was in the 17th century. Alchemists have a bad rap. We think of them as being mystics, as not doing a lot of experimental science, but research has shown that they were actually extremely diligent. They used, in some cases, modern scientific techniques, and they had some really, really good ideas. They were convinced, for example, of the corpuscular theory of matter, right? That everything is made of little tiny bits, and that these can be recombined to create different substances, which is correct. They were on the right track. Their problem was they didn't have precise enough equipment to make the discoveries they needed to. The big discovery you need to make as an alchemist is mass balance, that everything that you start with weighs as much as what you end with. But some of those things might be gases or liquids, and they just didn't have the precision. They had to wait till the 18th century. And they had some clues that weren't helpful. So mercury is a metal that is liquid at room temperature. Woohoo, it's no big deal to us. It's just a quirk of the periodic table. But to them, that seemed to be a really significant and deep clue. Mercury was at the heart of this alchemical system, and their search for the philosopher's stone, which was going to be a way to turn base metals into gold. So I got to thinking about what if we could send a modern chemistry textbook back in time to Richard Starkey or Sir Isaac Newton, who did a lot of alchemical research. What would their reaction be? I think first they would just flip through to see, did you find the Philosopher's Stone, the key to their quest? And our answer is kind of yeah, but it makes radioactive gold. So they'd be like, well, radioactivity, what's that? I'm like, well, invisible magic rays that will kill you if you stand in the same room as it. So a lot of the struggle would be to just not make it sound mystical. To us, it's scientific, but to them, it's very, very voodoo and spooky. And then further on, we'd say, but we do use transubstantiation, your philosopher's stone, in order to make this metal that is very handy, because if you take 2 lumps of it and smack them together, you can blow up a city. So that's kind of cool. And then further on, we'd say, actually, the philosopher's stone you were looking for, it's up in the sky. Every single star you see is the source of reactions that change elements from one to another. And every particle in your body was actually once in a star. So think about that for a while and how you feel. And not just that, but we've discovered that the forces that hold us together are the same as the lightning in the sky, and the reason that I can see you is the same reason that your cat gives me a spark when I pet it, and the force that keeps me from plummeting through the floor is the same thing as well, and that these forces are defined by simple mathematical laws that fit on an index card.
This part of Maciej's talk is great. He's just really good at talking about science and just a smart guy overall.
I don't think it would be possible to communicate this without sounding like a mystic and invoking God and things that, concepts that were at the heart of their belief system. So I think we're in the same boat with artificial intelligence. I think that we have some clues. We have some really big clues. There's the mystery of consciousness, that this box of meat on my head is self-aware, and that hopefully, presumably, unless it's the simulation, you guys also experience this through awareness. But we don't even know how to ask questions about consciousness because it's so, we're lost in the dark. We have other clues like the fact that every smart animal seems to need to sleep and it seems to dream. We know how brains develop in children. We know how important language seems to be to cognition. We have all these pieces, and we have pieces from computer science as well. We're having real success at identifying things in images and sounds the way the brain seems to do. So there's a lot coming up, but there's also things that we are terribly mistaken about, and unfortunately we just don't know what they are. And there's things that we massively underestimate the complexity of. Just like the alchemist who held a rock in one hand and a piece of wood in the other and thought they were roughly the same substance, not understanding that the wood was orders of magnitude more complex. We're the same way with the study of minds. And that's exciting. We're going to learn a lot, but it's going to take some time. And in the meantime, there's this quote I love. If everybody contemplates the infinite instead of fixing the drains, many of us will die of cholera. In the near future, the kind of AI and machine learning that we have to face is much different, and it has ethics problems of its own. It's like if those Alamogordo scientists had decided to completely focus on whether they were going to blow up the atmosphere and forgot that they were building nuclear weapons that also had to be dealt with.
Wait, but it's critically important that we focus on the question of whether the nuclear test is going to blow up the atmosphere and then not do the nuclear test if it was going to blow up the atmosphere. Stop everything while you focus on that and resolve it. So his advice is applicable after we've resolved the non-doominess of the nuclear test. This is an instance where if you just follow his own analogy, we really need to focus hard on testing or somehow knowing that the AI is not going to blow up the world before we continue its development and then deal with other problems of continued development.
So there's ethical questions in machine learning, and they're not about things becoming self-aware and taking over the world. They're about how people can exploit other people or through lapses of thought introduce kind of immoral behavior into automated processes that are going to become more and more important in our daily lives. And of course, there's the question of how power relationships are affected by machine learning and AI. We've already seen that surveillance has become a de facto part of our lives in an unexpected way. We never foresaw that it would look quite like this, but it is here. This is the NSA data center for people who aren't familiar with it. So we have this world, and at the top of this world, the people who are running the show are obsessed with a crazy idea. So what I hope I've done today is shown you that you can learn something from Stephen Hawking's cat. No matter how much they tell you to get in the carrier, do your own thing. I hope that I've made you just a little bit dumber today from my talk so that you don't get caught on the superintelligence idea. And hopefully, I can persuade you that in the absence of good leadership from the people at the top of our industry, it's up to us to try to make an effort to contribute and to really think through all of the ethical and difficult issues that AI has created for us. Mostly, I want to thank you for letting me blather on about this weird topic in front of you and for your rapt attention. Thank you so much.
Okay, so two things about Maciej's talk are extremely impressive. Number one, the fact that in 2016, when nobody was talking about AI Doom virtually, except Elon Musk and Eliezer Yudkowsky and Nick Bostrom, a really small niche. During that time, he decided to give a talk on why we shouldn't worry about Doom and just get into that fight, which is such a popular fight to have today, such a popular debate, but he was having it in 2016. So props to him for going to an area of focus that is now kind of almost universally agreed to be very important and very interesting and wasn't at the time. So that's number one. Number two is he's amazing at talking about science and making these connections. I'm just a fan of him overall. He's also a successful entrepreneur that runs a bookmarking site called Pinboard, so that's why he mentioned being a web developer. So those are like the good highlights from the talk. And then on the bad side, I just didn't find any of the arguments remotely convincing. And the outside view arguments, I just engage with it for the hell of it. I don't even think they're really relevant. The inside arguments, I think, were pretty meaty, right? It let me talk about things like, hey, there's a speed limit to natural selection, and that's why we only have 1 megabyte in the genome, and that's why we even have a childhood phase. And AI is not going to have a childhood phase because it's not going to have a 1 megabyte brain genome, right? So that's when we got into the weeds, when we got into the substance of the issues that tell us whether we're doomed or not. And I felt like all of his issues were weak, but for interesting reasons. Overall, I thought it was a great talk because he listed out so many interesting counter-arguments against the claim of AI doom. I do feel like I was able to satisfactorily address all of them one by one. So basically, like, he shot a bunch of bullets at me. I feel like I had a bulletproof vest. I was able to absorb them all. It's up to you, the viewer, to judge. Maciej, if you're watching this video and you have thoughts, I'd love to hear them. And better yet, I'd love to have you come on and just do a live debate or a discussion about your updated thoughts on Doom. I mean, I'm responding to something that you said 8 years ago, so it's totally fair to think that you've updated your views and maybe you disagree with some of the stuff you've said, and maybe you have other thoughts, maybe you have stronger arguments why, from the perspective of 2024, watching how things have played out, you have other reasons why you think that AI is not going to kill us. For instance, maybe you agree with Martin Casado saying, hey, these LLM type AIs are only going to be a little bit better than stochastic parrots. They're only going to either simulate things using a lot of computational resources, or else they're going to give you things that are somehow close to something else and some kind of probability distribution. I mean, that would be the kind of example of a non-doom argument somebody would come and make in 2024 that wouldn't have been on the radar in 2016. So one way or the other, would love to hear more updated thoughts about this from Maciej. I encourage everybody to just follow Maciej on Twitter just because he's cool. That just about does it for today's episode. I've got more exciting debates and takedown episodes coming up. If you have any requests, just let me know in the comments. And just to remind you, this is a mission that most of you watching this channel are on together with me. We all would like to see society wake up to the urgent threat of AI and why pausing it is the only policy that's not ridiculously reckless. So if you want to do your part, if you don't want to do anything crazy, if you just want to do your part using a few clicks of the mouse, I make it easy for you. You just have to think of a couple friends or some forum that you're on where this kind of content would be relevant, and then go paste a link to it. Just have to paste a link. Or go to Apple Podcasts and write a good review of Doom Debates to get more people to watch it that way. Or if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, that's the easiest thing of all. You just go to youtube.com/@doomdebates, click subscribe. You've done your helpful thing for the day. Thanks very much for your support. And I'll see you all next time here on Doom Debates.